So much for joining us. Oh, just say got it. Okay. A few housekeeping things. First of all, since there are so many of us on here on your screen, you might want to go to speaker view so that you see the actual person speaking, because otherwise you have to search for her in the Hollywood squares. So go to the view. It's usually in the upper right-hand corner of your computer and click on speaker view. Okay, and then you've already been muted, so that's great. I want to thank my education committee. That's Nancy Bond and Andrea Feldman and Kate Massey. Thank you to these women for helping out with all the planning. We will have time for questions at the end. If you meanwhile have questions during the presentation, can you please put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them as appropriate. And that's it. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. So you also the write-up about Reverend Myra Brown on the invitation for this event. So I won't repeat that information, but rather I'd like to share a story about Reverend Myra that appeared in city newspaper last February after she gained notoriety for diffusing the dangerous standoff between police and Black Lives Matter protesters last year. So as pastor at Spiritus Christi Church, she was asked where the roots of her faith took hold. And she told the story of the teacher, the mother, and the paddle. So in second grade, the swing of the paddle, when she was in second grade, the swing of the paddle along the backside was the punishment for misbehavior. And unfortunately, it was doled out more eagerly for Black students. And young Myra happened to receive a paddling from her teacher for asking permission to use the restroom. When her mother found out about this, she marched into the school and demanded to speak with her daughter's teacher. She told the principal, "This teacher paddled my second grader, and I'm going to let her know what that feels like." And Myra never received another paddling after that. But she says now that my mother modeled speaking truth to power and being able to cut it into what was just and what was unjust. This recollection from her childhood encapsulates the maxims of the faith in which her parents taught her to live. Stand up for the oppressed and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I'm very pleased to present Reverend Myra Brown.
Thank you so much, Judy, for that. And I just want to say it's so good to be here with you. And I'm honored and humbled that you've asked me to just to talk with you about my perspective on protests that kind of took our city by storm, and the need for reparations, why support the idea of reparations in Rochester as those conversations are rising. So I am actually going to share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Did you want to put it in slide mode so the slides will be showing?
Is it not in slide mode?
No, go to slideshow and start your up at the top, almost there, slide where it says slideshow.
Yeah, I gotta move it down to get to it. Let's see. There it is. Slideshow.
There you go. And then play from start. There you go.
From start. Thank you. All right. So as you asked me to think about this, I went in my archives for pictures, and the first one that I came up with was this one. And this is really one of my most heartening pictures because it really shows a Rochester of many different colors, many different classes of people that kind of came together through those protests in a time where we've had a history in Rochester of people of color sort of being the only ones, out in the street, calling for racial justice, trying to talk about what it is for us as our lived experiences in structures and systems, and policing, in employment, and all these kinds of systems. And then George Floyd happened, and George Floyd brought together a nation where there was no more white denial, there was no more white interrogation of people of color narratives, and we all were home because the pandemic helped us to be there and to see it together. And we couldn't come up with any other reason except maybe those people of color were right. Maybe there is a different experience that they were having. And then our world started to change. We started calling for transformation in policing everywhere. Um, and then in Rochester, particularly, we learned about Daniel Prude. And so while we were standing up and protesting about injustices that were happening in other cities, this issue had now come to our doorstep. And so we hit the streets. And I'm so grateful to our LGBTQ plus leadership that really have put their bodies on the line, and they have been in the forefront of many of these organizing many of these protests. And so I had relationships with different folks throughout over time, because our parish in 2006, we made a decision to be an anti-racist church. And what that meant is it was a commitment to build racial knowledge and to build racial stamina and to be active in the issues that emerged in our own city, in our own backyard, as well as those that were happening around the country. And so that is what we did. And so really by the time George Floyd and particularly Daniel Prude hit our city, I think Spiritus Christi was particularly ready to partner in this work of racial justice around it. And so the other that I have here is I realized that putting thousands of bodies on the street also was not free.
This is some amazing video. 51 years ago this week, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then this happened. In our NewsAid archives, this was the scene on April 9th, 1968, the day of Dr. King's funeral. King's death sparked a national outcry and a huge march in Rochester. Thousands of people walked together in a silent procession beginning on Troop Street, crossing the Court Street Bridge. Then they headed to the Civic Center Plaza in downtown Rochester. The march was followed by a memorial service, many still brought to tears by King's murder just 4 days earlier.
So as you can see, Rochester has had a long history, right, of Black and brown folks hitting the streets and really, being a voice to the world, saying, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with our systems. There's something wrong with our structures. There's something wrong that Black and brown people have been left to live in a culture of struggle and a culture of culpability, and that lacks the kind, and a culture of inequity that lacks the kind of freedom that we saw many in the white community being able to afford. And so those protests in our own city, over 50 years later, look like this. Let's see. What happened? Sharing was paused. What happened?
America, land of the free. It's at the core of who we are. Freedom. The freedom to live without.
So this is what our streets look like, right? Day after day after day after day after day. Um, our young people, our LGBTQ plus community, our entire Rochester community came together night after night, calling for justice for Daniel Krug. And you remember the pepper spray and the rubber bullets. We looked like an occupied city. And that's exactly what it felt like. Some nights I was just exhausted, trying to go home. Let me just stop sharing that one. Some nights I was just exhausted, night after night. The protests, the pepper spray, the chants, the just that the atmosphere and the feeling like, wondering if we were ever going to be heard on these issues of justice. I'm trying to get you to the next screen here. Ah, there it is down there.
You're watching News 8.
This is some amazing video. 50.
And then you may remember that I got into the paper because of this.
Now, some demonstrators were hurt throughout all of this, and they tell us there was excessive use of tear gas and other chemicals used by police, causing injuries.
There's a lot of eye injuries specifically because they're pointing their balls directly at people's faces. A lot of people have bruises, lacerations just from getting hit with rubber bullets.
And this was my church.
Now, some of those who were hurt took cover inside the Spiritus Christi Church. We're told folks there were treating some of those individuals. As you can see here, demonstrators pointing out to us pepper ball blasts left marks on the side of that church building.
So on that particular night, after protesting for days with the leaders who were leading us in the streets, we had this event that was kind of a turning point for us, where the police literally brought their fight to our doorstep at our church, because they hemmed in protesters onto Fitzhugh Street after they declared it unlawful for us to march down Exchange to the public safety building, which was where we were going. And then they declared it unlawful, and chaos kind of broke out. There were people in cars. We don't know if these people were sort of planted there. We don't know where they came from, but I remember seeing a young man start throwing firecrackers to get it all going. And then the police just started indiscriminately spraying pepper spray, rubber bullets. They had sonic booms. They had police dogs, and just all hell broke loose. And I couldn't breathe. People started running. They were grabbing people. It was just mayhem. And we realized that we weren't going to be allowed to go and march peacefully up to Exchange Street like we had hoped to the public safety building. And so I left to go back to the church, because we had anticipated that there would be some injuries and that protesters may need some care. So we put together a medical team of volunteers who were here at the church, and they were waiting in case somebody needed attention. And so I came back because I saw people coughing and having trouble breathing. I saw people limping. And so I came back to tell them, you know what, I think there are going to be people tonight that you're going to need to take care of. And so they got into their medic car and they went to find some of those folks, and they brought back I saw 3 people that they brought back before I left because I needed to go and preach at my church the next morning and work on a homily. And it was already about 11 o'clock, 10 or 11 o'clock. And so I left after telling them that would happen. I saw them bring 3 people in who were limping and who had been hit. One woman was limping, and another woman, could barely walk. Somebody else had kind of like these facial burns from the chemicals. And so they were getting some attention by our medical team. And so I left and I said, you know what, if anything happens, call me. Call me, and if you need me, I'll come back. So I went home, and I probably wasn't home for maybe 15 minutes or so. And my operations manager called me to tell me that the riot police had hemmed about 100 or so protesters in on Fitzhugh Street in front of my church, and they started just spraying them with pepper balls, pepper spray, and that it was kind of mayhem. And he said, Reverend Myra, we want to let them in and get them to safety. Like, what do we do? And I said, absolutely, let them in. He was there actually with our young adult minister, who is also an activist with Free to People Rock. And so they let all those folks in and tried to get them into safety. And while they were doing that, he called me again and he said, Reverend Myra, they've formed kind of in front and around our church, and they're exhibiting these intimidating stances towards the protesters. Like, one officer walked up and slammed our gate shut behind the protesters and stood there kind of with his arms here while the others were still in formation around the church. And so we had 100 or so protesters inside. They were scared. They didn't know if they could be safe coming out. You had police that were outside of our church. And so when he called me, I got on the phone, and I was up probably until about 2 o'clock that morning, on and off the phone, calling the mayor, calling the police chief, telling them they needed to stand down, giving them the 411 on what's happening inside my church. I was just outraged. I couldn't believe that they would pen these people up in the church and feel that was okay. It wasn't okay. And so it took me until about 2 o'clock to navigate that and to get the police to stand down and to let those protesters out. Our folks from the church escorted them in small groups to their cars so that they could go about their way and be safe. And there was, my understanding, lots of community that was happening inside the building between the folks who were able to just care for each other in that. So the next morning, I did do my Sunday morning preaching, and then I called the mayor, and I said, we have to talk, because what happened last night cannot happen again. That can never happen again. And so I asked for a meeting, and she happened to be across the street on Sunday morning. And so after church, I went over and we met to talk about this protest. And so we had a great conversation about the fact that the way in which police were engaging our community around, particularly the Black community and the brown community, around grief. We were grieving not just a present death, but a present death that had historical trauma for us. For Black and brown folks, we understand our history was full of Black and brown folks at the behest of a system of policing power and system power that harmed us and had generational impact. And so what I said was, the wrong way to respond to this level of protest is for the very people who've been accused of committing the killing of Daniel Prude to be the ones who are now babysitting the community of color. And that it's much more traumatizing. And it's especially traumatizing if you then say, I'm not going to let you go up this street. I'm going to put my officers here. I'm not going to let you go up this street. We're going to stop you from doing that. Like, it just exacerbated this situation. And so we talked about what the community really needed was to be able to grieve. I asked her to get those police off of those street corners, get those barriers out of the way, let the people discharge what they're feeling inside, give them the freedom to go and protest in front of that public safety building, and wherever else they needed to protest, because this is generational and historical injustice and trauma. It's just manifested itself currently with Daniel Prude. And so she asked, talked about, so Reverend Myra, how do we make sure that, that there isn't major chaos and rioting and all kinds of violence that the police say that they were worried about. And so the protesters the night before, I've been credited with this, but really this elder model was in play the night before that Sunday. That Saturday when they ran us away from Exchange Street, there were probably about 6 elders in the front of the line. Now it's only 6, and there were thousands of people there. And so it didn't quite work the way that it did on that Sunday when I talked with the mayor. But when we talked, I said, we can reuse this elder model. We can use the elder model. But I said to her, we probably needed about, 50 to 100 elders in the front of the line. And I was drawing that model. I understood the model because James Thompson and Shirley Thompson are African American, and they were part of an elders and allies group that I was also part of. And so there were emails circulating around, and I knew that they had actually tried, recruiting, and I think they recruited maybe those 6 elders on that Saturday night. But once mayhem broke, it just didn't work. So I said to the mayor, let me recruit 50 to 100 elders from the community. Let me make the call, because we know what we're doing. Our model of eldership is to come alongside of our young people, to come alongside of people who are oppressed. Black and brown folks have been doing this forever. And so we knew how to do it. And so we just needed to put people in the front of the line. Once you got those police officers out of the way, to be able to attend to our own community's needs, to walk with them, to hold their hearts, to hold their anger, their rage, to affirm them, right? And it is the right way, I think, to walk with people who are experiencing trauma and re-trauma. And, we put out the call, which was this next, is it the next picture? Let's see. Yes. So that was the press conference that I joined. The mayor asked me to join her press conference, and I could put out a call to the community to come and be an elder at the front lines of that protest. And so that's what we did. And we were able to, the community responded amazingly. And we got over 100 elders from the community that showed up at our church. And so we were able to talk to them and go over with them, what we needed from the elders. And the mayor gave us 2 buses so that the elders could have rides to the public safety building and to the protest. And that Sunday night, we had more than enough elders to be part of that protest. And part of the narrative was, that we were trying to keep them from being violent, but really we were there to keep them safe. We were there to keep them safe and to walk with them. We weren't working for the system with elders. We were actually walking with the marginalized with this model, this cultural model of eldership. And so we were able to change the trajectory of the protest, because once you see a model that works, you can't unsee it, right? And we had our first night of no violence from the police. And I became the point person. We had an agreement that they would call me if they started to get antsy on my cell phone, and they did. I got several calls that night, and none of them panned out. They were all just sort of nervous jitters from the police. I see this. Reverend Myra, I think somebody's breaking the barrier over here. Reverend Myra, I think somebody's, got a firecracker on this side. I checked out all those things. None of it was real. And so I was able to just say, no, there's nothing going on here. They're fine. and to just be with the people that night. And then after that, you may have seen this picture that appeared in the paper. And this happened after that Sunday night. The officers showed up because the protesters had taken over City Hall. They'd taken over City Hall because they really weren't feeling heard around firing the officers who had killed Daniel Prude, and around making the changes. They wanted the policing budgets to be reallocated, so there was a call to defund the police so that we can invest more in communities of color, to attend to the historical harm that our policing system has caused. And it was a reality that our policing system was, the blueprint was crafted in 1819. In 1819, Black people were still slaves in New York State. New York State did not end slavery until 1825 or 1827. So there's just no way that our policing system, when it was created to serve Black and brown people. It was not. It was never intended to do that. It was intended to protect white property and wealth and attend to white anxiety from people of color. And that's why you have a policing system that surveils us, that monitors Black and brown folks, that is built in, sort of let's control them. And that really has not changed. I mean, there's different ways in which that looks, but the blueprint is the same. It continues to be the same. So when the activists said, let's defund the police, I thought that is exactly right. We should reallocate those funds. And part of that reallocation should be to create a new policing blueprint that doesn't just benefit those who are white, but should benefit all of Rochester citizens, and particularly people of color. And so we began to do that work of calling for the reallocation of funds, the transformation of our policing systems. And our governor also jumped in and started calling for reform. Governors all over the country started to call for reform. But what we were asking for was transformation. We really wanted a new policing blueprint. We really wanted new structures, new processes, new policies and procedures that stopped harming people of color. And we're still in that fight, trying to seek those things.
Reverend Myra, there's one question. Kathy Hart has a question.
Sure.
It's a good time.
Kathy?
Kathy, unmute yourself to ask your question.
Actually, I hit that button by mistake, so thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, go
I
ahead.
remember I was there. I loved listening to you, Myra.
Oh, thanks, Kathy.
All right.
Memory. Here we go.
Yeah, so on this particular day, I was actually in my office and having a meeting, and my phone started going off. I've spent years in this community doing activism and protesting with groups and forging relationships because justice is important to me. As you said in the beginning, I grew up in a family where justice and equity was important to my mom and my dad. And so it was part of the legacy, I think, that they transferred to me and my siblings. And so my phone was going off, and when I finally answered it, one of the activists said, "Reverend Myra, they've arrested protesters and they're chasing young people, and they were getting some people, just taking them off the sidewalk. Some people were on the step that they took, and other people were on the sidewalk, and young people were running, and so they said, would you come?" And so I was on my way. I left my meeting and I started to make my way around the corner. And when I came outside, actually, of the church, there were police officers there. And they told me that the police chief was looking for me and that he wanted me to come and see if I could talk to the protesters to have them move from City Hall. And so I got escorted around the corner. The police wanted me to go around the corner to kind of talk to the protesters and remove them for them. The protesters were wanting me to see what their impact was with this group of riot police and how they were being targeted. And when I got around the corner, I found Ashley Gant, and I asked her what was going on, and she told me. And so I asked her, what did she need? Because when I look at this picture, you have this group of folks who are really holding all the systemic power. The protesters weren't holding the lion's share of power. They were calling for justice. And so I made a decision in this moment whose side I was going to stand on, and that was the side of justice. So I asked Ashley, would it be helpful if I got arrested with you? And she said, really? I said, yes. I had never been to jail before, but I've seen a lot of people doing it, and this seemed like a good as time as any to take a stand for justice and what was right, because they wanted to arrest these young people for standing on the street, public streets that were legal to protest on, and public sidewalks that were legal to protest on, and run them through a criminal justice system and put charges on them and change the trajectory of their futures and their finances with the use of power in the systems. And I thought, they may not be able to afford to do that, but I can certainly be in solidarity with them. And so I went up to this officer and I said, I would like to be arrested. And he said, what? Reverend Myra, no. And I said, yes, I'd like to be arrested. If you're going to arrest them, then you have to arrest me too. And that changed the conversation, because in this moment, I had a relationship with people on both sides of this. I had a relationship with the police chiefs and the people who were responsible for this. And I had a relationship with the protesters who were struggling against it. And so this lovely young man said, Reverend Myra, let me call the police chief. There's gotta be a way we can work this out. We don't want to arrest you. And so I realized in that moment that privilege again, right, was showing up. And this is what happens, right, with privilege when it gets used to maintain power and oppression, is that those who are powerless and who have less privilege are more subjected to inequity and oppression and power. And so here he was giving me deference, right? And so he made the phone call and he called the police chief and he told him that I was wanting to be arrested. And then he came back and he said, Reverend Myra, he said to just work it out with you. We don't want to arrest you. There's got to be something we can do. And then we started to talk about what we could do, right? And so I said, there is something we can do. We can let these protesters protest on the sidewalk. And he said, oh, Reverend Myra, but couldn't you just move them to the parking lot out of the way, because then we need to clean the steps. We need to remove the stuff that they have there, Reverend Myra, and the city needs to come in and do some cleanup of the removing of the flyers. Can't we do that? And I said, you know what, we could do that, but aren't these public sidewalks? He said, yes. I said, then they have a constitutional right to protest on the public sidewalks. He said, but Reverend Myra, we need to clean up. I said, I think we can do both. We can clean up and we can let them protest on the public sidewalks. He said, well, Reverend Myra, the city has to come in. I said, I think we can do those. We can do that too. The city can come in and clean up. You guys can do what you need to do down there. And then when you're done, the protesters need to be allowed to go back on the sidewalks and protest. And so they gave us what I asked for. The city came in, they removed tents and equipment, and the police kind of stood guard around them so that could happen. And once that was all done, they moved. They stood down and they backed away and they were called off. And so we were also able to negotiate them putting the Black Lives Matter flag back up on the flagpole, because then they wanted to removed the Black Lives Matter flag down, and they handed it to me to hand to the protesters. I did, and then I had a different thought, like, they have their own Black Lives Matter sign that was up from George Floyd. Why couldn't we leave the protesters sign up there? flag up there. And so we were able to put that flag back on the pole and have these officers go back to where they had come from. And so we were able to diffuse this moment as well. So pretty much, it really kind of laid bare, right? These long-standing issues of injustice that our members in communities of color have been really struggling with. And as I said earlier, we've been on the streets with Eric Gardner, Philando Castile, leading up to George Floyd, and that very public killing of George Floyd really brought us together. And I'll take this next one. The critical mass of folks in the streets made a difference, right? Our church having a long-standing history of social justice issues, I think was right for the moment. We had been involved as a parish in social justice issues like women in pastoral leadership, women's ordination. We protested around the environment, immigration issues. We took stands around marriage equality. And so again, when our city was enthralled in these issues around racial justice, we were ready, I think. So I think, I was asked my perspective on the protest. What I think is that I think you cannot address racial injustice without confronting people in power who participate in it. And that does take a level of courage. It also takes a level of practice. That it isn't organic. Like you have to start with some injustice that you're willing to stand up for, that you're willing to unmute your voice for, that you're willing to speak to, and that you're willing to take some consequences for, right? Because the people that you're walking with and you're standing up with and you're standing up for have been subjected to the impact alone. And so we have to make a decision whether we're going to be in solidarity with the oppressed and people on the margins or not. Or are we going to just kind of go on about our business and, and hope things kind of work out? And so, I think that was one of the first things, was to just make the decision that we have to confront the people in power. And so having conversations with the mayor, having conversations with the police chief, were really necessary pieces to have conversations with. To have conversations with people who were connected to folks who were making these systemic decisions. I think it was really, really important to do that. It was also important to listen to the voices of the people who were impacted, to center their voices. We live in these systems where we center the voices of white people and we center the voices of people in power. And what we displace are the voices of the marginalized and the voices of the oppressed. And if we continue to do that, then we don't ever get the full narrative. And we need the full narrative in order to make systemic changes in our systems and in our institutions. One of the things that I liked about the activists calling for defund the police, and I know there's a lot of difference in people supporting it or not supporting the defund the police campaign, but this image really captured it for me, which is why I totally supported it and still support it. I mean, you can use different language like reallocating funds, defund the police. It's really all the same thing. I mean, basically what they were saying is that we have crafted a system, an 1819 policing system, that over time we expect them to take care of everything. Drug possession, gang violence, drug dealing, theft, and school security, domestic violence, keep the peace, and every other unexpected crisis, as long as they go and handle it. But the system was not built in a way and constructed in a way to handle it with any justice in communities of color. And so what the activists were saying is that we need to take some of those resources and actually reallocate them so that we're not putting all that on the backs of a policing system that is ill-equipped to do that in all communities, but that we take those funds and we use them so that we have better education, that we have better job placement programs, that we have better drug treatment programs, that we have better mental health services and social workers and, affordable housing, and that we attend to health care and all of these other issues that have disparately impacted people of color, and that we know that it's impacted them because of economic deprivation and the ways in which we delegate our resources, right? And so for me, my thought is we really could become a new policing community if we really want to do that, if we work together to do that, if we craft a process of creating a new blueprint that would include police, community members, politicians, activists, and community members to really come together and create a real process of what does it look like? What's a real mission? What's a real vision for public safety that works for all of us, right? And so I think the protest brought us some good things, some awareness. People were more alert. There started to be some talk about reform, and there has been some reform. Many of those kinds of reforms have really nibbled around the edges, though, because qualified immunity is still in place. The policing force is still over 85% white. People of color still remain over-policed, even with the reforms, and overcharged. Even as we have a new response team for mental health, and even as we have new guidelines for how to engage protests under certain age groups and protesters and minors under a certain age group with pepper spray and pepper balls, those are all really, really good things. But the truth is we haven't changed the structure of policing. And sometimes reforms that nibble around the edges can convince us that we've made some progress there. Boy, we did something. We can do a lot more. Like, we can actually fix it. We can fix policing in Rochester if we bring the will to do it. And so I think, an authentic racial justice movement requires that we finish what we start, and not just settle kind of for nibbling around the edges. And part of that is to question the narratives that are given to us. People of color, we've learned to question those narratives because we've always had to deal with the consequences, right? And so, but I think in white communities, you don't necessarily question the narratives that are given, that the police give and people in power give. And so I think it's a big part of creating an authentic racial justice movement, questioning the narratives given in the world, in organizations, in our faith traditions that seem to always center whiteness in its norms, in its perspectives, in its expectations, in its permissions, in its resources, in its accessibility. Imagine if you are a person of color and that is what the game's rules are for the rest of your life. Like, it could never work, right? Because it requires then that you displace and marginalize the voices, the norms, the perspectives, the experiences, the expectations, permissions, and resources and accessibility of people of color. And I think we're in this age of justice. I think that we've been blessed with a time where we can actually make a real difference. But it's going to require that we broker necessary relationships, that we initiate meetings that matter, that we be courageous, that we practice cultural and social humility, that we earn the trust of those who struggle with injustice because of past hurts, trauma, and disappointment and disillusionment, and that we earn the trust of those who are in power so that we can speak truth to them. It's also going to require that we liberate ourselves from being people pleasers. I like for people to like me, but I learned in this that it's really an unrealistic expectation that everybody's going to like you if you are working for racial justice. And so you have to know what you've been called to and know why. Knowing your why is really, really important. And for me, my why was, my first why was my family groomed me for this. My second why was my faith requires this of me. Jesus, his whole mission, one of his mission statements, right, was to set the oppressed free, to liberate the oppressed. And so it's really a central part of my faith tradition as a Christian, as a pastor, to be active. And so it's really important to know what your why is. So these are some of the things that you know, that I talked about earlier, but one of them that I think is really important is when you began to speak truth to power, you can build a legacy of doing that. And I think it's really important. And that legacy of speaking truth to power really has to begin with self. We have to be first partakers of that. And what I mean by this, I think that each of us hold some level of power in our lives, right? And I would guess that we have some regret about how we used power in some area in our lives, or wish we had used it differently. For me, it was my self-examination came around being a parent and how I used power with my own children. You know, I grew up with parents from the South, and they said, "You do this because I said so," right? And so it was a way to use power and to displace the voices of the children because we were the adults and we knew better, right? And we knew right. And there were certain cultural practices that were passed on that just were not fair and they were not just. And so I had to interrogate my own life, my own use of power, and make those changes so that I could be more authentic when I called on systems to do that. And so that was really important. So I'm grateful for that time of protest, and I also realize that the work is not done. We have lots more work yet to do. The need for reparations investment in the Black and Brown community, it's huge. It's huge here in Rochester, in particular, because I took the time to did a little list here. So reparations, right, is really it's contextual and it's historical, and it's not just sort of an abstract concept, right, of who has been harmed by discrimination, right, that Black people can bring along, or brown people or people of color, to build a strong justification, right, to white people and those who might resist the call for it. Reparations really has three components to it, four components actually. The first one is acknowledgement, right? Reparations program, it should engage with a process of recognition or admission of the wrong by the perpetrators or the beneficiaries of these major social injustices. And the apology should take place, and it should be accompanied by a commitment to redress the harm, right, which can take two different forms. One form is atonement, right? And so that redress can take form in that, but the perpetrators or the beneficiaries must meet conditions of forgiveness on the part of the victims. And that's the important part. That's why there has to be this kind of coming together and conversations about why reparations and what does that look like for communities of color, particularly in Rochester, right? Because the victim of the harm must be the one to establish what the terrain is for forgiveness. And it should be in good faith negotiations between those who are wronged and the wrongdoers or the wrongdoing institution. And then I think the third component is the restitution, right? The restoration of the survivors to the condition that they've experienced prior to the injustice or the position that they might have attained in the absence of the injustice. And so restitution is somewhat different, I think, because it offers a metric sort of based upon a presumed or imagined alternative state of affairs for the victimized population of folks. And then third, the final part of reparations really is having some closure, right? Some mutual reconciliation should take place, where there are no further claims made by the victim community for a race-specific or group-specific program unless there's a new round of injustices. Now, in Rochester in particular, people say, well, what does Rochester have to do reparations for? I think there's lots of stuff, right? So the experience of enslavement also touched Rochester, right? So Rochester itself, the three gentlemen who purchased Rochester, Nathaniel Rochester, Fitzhugh, and I forget the other guy's name, but they purchased this area with the wages from slave money. Like they made their income off of enslavement. These were slave owners, Black slave owners. And so they took that money and they bought this land we called Rochester. And not only did they use enslaved labor wages to buy Rochester, but they brought slaves with them. And those slaves, black slaves, were used to clear the swamp and to clear the forestry, to drain the swamps, to make Rochester habitable. That was here. That wasn't the South. That's Rochester, right? And we have the history of that just continues. There's a whole book, if you have a chance to purchase it, it's called In Defiance, which lists, it's about this thick, of all the runaway New York State um, slaves who were enslaved, who were running away, and all the notices that went in the paper trying to get people to return them to their owner. That was New York State, not the South. And so we are very much connected to the experience of enslavement. And so the cotton that was being picked in the South, right, we had the textiles in the North that had to process it. So we have been connected to this institution of slavery for Black and brown folks and their descendants for a very long time. And then you add sort of the other incidences that have been happening here in Rochester, you know, the discrimination, right, in education, the health disparities, the employment discrimination, the housing discrimination, right, the urban renewal policies that came through Rochester and divided Black and brown communities and displaced them, the gentrification, the overcriminalization for marijuana possession that's impacted Black and brown communities more than any other community in Rochester, right? The poverty that Black and brown communities have been steeped in, right? We are number 5, our children in poverty in the state. Like that didn't just happen overnight. It happened as a result of these policies, these practices that happened right here in Rochester. The police brutality, the political disenfranchisement. So there is plenty of reason to support the call for reparations and the investment into the Black and brown community. These practices, this history has taken so much out of the Black and brown community that I think that it is time for us to repair that harm and reinvest back into the Black and brown communities to address that harm that has been done, that has impacted the Black and brown community here in Rochester. And I think I'm going to stop right there. Take questions.
Reverend Myra, thank you so much for that incredibly powerful sharing of your experience. And it's such a testament to the power of nonviolent protest and what a lesson of speaking truth to power back from 2nd grade from your mother. I want to have time, if you have time, for about 10 minutes of questions.
Absolutely.
I'd like to open up. People can either put something in the chat or put something under, raise your hand under the reactions part.
Judy, can I just ask Myra, can I stop your screen sharing?
Yes, you can.
Okay,
I'll stop it for you.
Thank
How's
you.
that? There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And a couple of people shared earlier in the chat that they remembered the protests of 1964.
Yeah.
And someone said, we've not seen the kind of change that is needed in Rochester.
Mm-hmm.
And another person mentioned an interesting article in the New York Times yesterday that deals with the difficulty of making real change.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, part of the difficulty of making real change, you know, I kind of alluded to it in the beginning, is that, you know, the call is that we have to build collective racial knowledge and racial stamina if we're going to make real change, because the system is always going to push back. But we have to stay strong. We have to stay strong together. And we have to keep pushing together and make those demands that our systems change. And if they don't, there may come a time where we decide that we're not going to participate anymore in the ways that we have, right? Because if there is no cost to the system, there's no really need to change.
I'm encouraged that you're hopeful.
I am hopeful. Because I think if we can't do this in Rochester, we can't do it anywhere. honestly. I mean, we are, there's a little bit of a duplicity in Rochester, but we tout that we're the home of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, and we are, right? Um, so we do know how to protest, and we have made some progress, but because we haven't really changed a lot of the structural um, pieces and centered the voices and the perspectives of people of color so that we can really know what's going on, we haven't made the kind of progress that we need to make, right? Because then we leave ourselves with the possibility of deniability, right? If we don't get the whole story, then we can always claim deniability. I'm not sure about that. Let's see, I see some questions there.
Yeah. Can you think about ways the Giving Circle can best help address this reparations issue?
Yeah. Right now, there is a committee of us that are on the reparations committee that the mayor has put together. One of and we're in process, but one of the things that is helpful is for organizations to support that call and to support that work. And the other way is to try to move resources into organizations that are led by people of color. Right now, they have to go through so much red tape just to be eligible for resources to do the work that they're doing. And it's many of the communities of color organizations that are trying to attend to the historical trauma, right? They're trying to help folks in the community who they have relationship capital with, who trust them, and they're doing this work on shoestring budgets. I can't tell you how many times that I sit with some of our leaders who are doing this work in the community who just are frustrated because it's like, Reverend Myra, whenever the grants come out, I see the same organizations that are white led are getting the lion's share of the resources, and the organizations of color are getting just a fraction of what they need. And they really are the ones who know how to do that work. They know how to do it. I can go into a community, and I do go in with my team, and we go door to door and we talk to people of color. And, we come out of that in one day, just knowing so much more about, there's so much disclosure, there's so much transparency that people share, and there's so much trust that they just give over because they understand that I know, right, what their experience is, that I'm not going to judge them. I'm not going to offer some kind of interrogation of their narrative. I'm going to try to figure out how do we walk together to try to get you what you need. And I think we've left people of color in this community hurting and in harm's way for too long. It's time for us to care for them. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me to know that people are living from a wounded place, from a hurting place, from a generationally harmed place, and say, well, hopefully it'll work out. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. When we have the resources that we need and we have the desire, we just need to come together and do it, take on Nike's slogan.
So that leads into another question. How can we create opportunities for white people and people of color to get to know one another and communicate with one another? We don't want to be so separate.
Yeah, so like, for example, we've planned some community conversations on reparations. We can almost guarantee that people of color are going to show up for that. I think white people have to sign up for those things too. And I think that hosting town hall meetings where you're inviting people of color and white people to come together and perhaps you have a panel of us come to talk and invite people to come together you can do some small group conversations. You can put up some reflection questions about what you want people to talk about. What is it that you don't know about racial injustice in this city? And if you had 3 hopes of what could happen. I mean, I think there's a lot of things we can do to bring white people and people of color together. You could support faith communities to put those events together. I've been bringing people of color and white people together for years to have community conversations around racism. But we've never gotten any support for that outside of what our church has supported. I think there's lots of ways to support that work, and with additional support with what the faith communities are doing and what um, activist communities are doing, I think that we can bring lots of people together. I think we need to fund that work, fund those dialogues, encourage people to come together and have these conversations. Support racial justice training and groups and organizations that are doing that. I've been able to move our church where we are around racial justice really because I've been offering trainings to our community since 2006. And just being consistent so that we have common language, we have common understanding, right? And so when we began to have these conversations, we learn something from each other, and we're able to walk with each other differently.
I'd like to ask Ann Johnson to
Mhm.
speak about inclusive recovery.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you so much, Myra. I think that getting to know each other better is critical. I've been part of a Shades of Sisterhood group for 7 years. That's half Black women and half white women, and I tell you, I've learned things that I never thought I would know, and that we have the trust and the ability to talk about things that that you wouldn't in a larger group. But what's happening now with the federal government is that much money is becoming available. We're calling it from ACT Rochester at our last report card event, inclusive recovery. And the intent, while we need to get to know each other, we have a point in time opportunity where more money is going to be available to communities than has been available since the New Deal. And so our approach is with the hard facts reports that ACT Rochester has done. We know the data. We know how the inequities are impacting. Well, we know the inequities are in our community. So how do we take opportunities for grants with all of the money that's coming for the federal government and hopefully potentially the money that's coming with the infrastructure plan to help people who haven't participated in the past? And that gets to the people who are Black and brown in our community. And like Myra said, there are people out there doing the work. We've got to provide the support and resources for them to be able to compete for the grants, to be able to respond and get the funding that's available so that it doesn't just go same old, same old. So there is a focus right now, and I know you'll hear more about it, but we actually did a whole webinar for ACT's report card event in May that talked about let's not miss this opportunity and let's use it as a way to put money where we haven't in the past. But as Myra said, I totally agree. We need the voices of the people who would say to us, you did it the right way, or we have made progress, and not just have a bunch of people who look like me and most of us on this meeting call telling us how the money should be spent. So inclusive recovery, keep your antenna up for more about it, but I'm encouraged. I think it provides the funding that we don't have to take away from somewhere else to support what we can do going forward.
And thank you for that. What I would say is not only do you want to make the grants available, earmarked, right, so that people of color can get them, but I would say pay attention to the processes that are created for people to access that money. There tends to be, when we start to think about getting resources to people of color, those old racial tropes come up. What I've seen people start with is, well, what if they take advantage of it? And what if people misuse the money? And what if, right? And it starts from sort of this really negative sort of place. And so the same kind of white-centered expectations for how to apply for the money gets integrated into that process. So on the surface, it looks like, we're really making a shift. We're making these funds available, but the barriers and the obstacles that are built into the process become just as harmful as the practice of not making the resources available. And so I think it becomes really important to push the decision makers around that kind of thinking, right? We're so used to thinking about people of color as being more distrustful as white communities and having to be more careful with them. We know the people are poor. We know people are struggling. We know that the work needs to be done. I think this calls for us to trust the leaders who are getting those resources to the people who need them the most, without the judgment, without the hesitation, without these backstops. I think that that part is really, really important. Um, and so I can't say enough about that particular piece. I get so many people who walk through my doors here at church in the community because they know I have a pastor's discretionary fund. And they would rather come here than go to an organization where they can get help with their rent or help with their food. And they all tell me because they feel like they get interrogated or that the process makes them feel like they're taking something just simply by showing up to ask for help. And so I think we have to pay attention to the nuances in the processes. I also see in the chat that Alex, one of my Spark members, had a wonderful comment. He said, another way to help is that white people can bring white people to support reparations and address their own reluctance to challenge other white people to the work of racial justice. That is another way that we can help each other around that. There are conversations I think that people of color need to have amongst themselves, and there are conversations that white people need to have, right? And we each need to try to bring our communities along so that we're prepared to engage each other and do the work collectively that we need to do to move our community. And there's just no reason we can't do that. We've got great people. We've got great people in this city and in this community. And there's no reason that we couldn't move this work forward.
Well, we probably have time for 2 more questions. I'm trying to get to all these, but do you think the change of mayor will help move change further? Oh, you're frozen. Oh, there you are.
I was trying to find a plug. Let me just, well, I do think that, I think there's certainly a possibility. Okay, I had to unplug my lamp to make sure my computer doesn't die on you. Yeah, so the change of mayor, it's very possible. Although, I found Mayor Warren was very supportive of the movement for reparations and looking at reparations program. I think that the Daniel Prude protests and the calls for leadership, I think those were really learning opportunities for her. And I think that a new mayor, Malik, will give us kind of a fresh look and a fresh start on these issues that our community has been struggling with, and I do think it will help. And I like that he has a strong financial background. He also has a strong cultural background. I've known Malik Evans since I was 16 years old. I've known his family since I was a teenager, and they've always been very upstanding, just incredible, clear, kind, compassionate, thoughtful, and wise people who have worked in the Black and Brown community, with a dedicated depth as long as I've known them. So I expect good things to come from the new mayor.
Great. And how is redlining still in play today?
How is redlining still in play today? I don't know if redlining was ever out of play, honestly. I mean, sometimes we talk about these things as if, I still meet moms, single moms who are trying to, get into our housing program. I talked to a young mom recently who qualified for a housing program where you could either have a house built or you could purchase an existing home. And she asked to have a house built in Henrietta. And she told me that they told her, oh, well, the builder's not building in there anymore, right? And so they kept redirecting her to the city to why don't you find a house in the city? So what you hear me saying is, I think we talk about some of these things as if they're in our history. They're not. They're not in our history, right? We may not use the same language, but we have taught our system. We have socialized folks in our system to continue to behave in those ways by using different language, but really moving people to the same space and the same experience. Um, so I think it's always with us. It's always with us. The sort of redlining and deciding that people of color, should live in these spaces, and there should be a limited amount of them that lives in our suburban areas. I mean, there's a reason why some of our suburban areas are still majority of white people and very few people of color. Very few. There's a resistance to build affordable housing in certain suburban um, areas. I mean, redlining, is what it is, right? We have not taken care of the housing injustice. That's just as we haven't taken care of the educational injustice, the policing injustice. These things are still with us. But we
Okay, and
have to
I'm
talk to
sorry.
people of color to, again, I keep going back to, you have to center the voices of people of color if you really want to know if these things are still in play.
Great. And I'm sorry, I have to end with one that has to do specifically with the work of the Giving Circle, which is how difficult are formal application processes like ours? And how do we work around that? And maybe you can't comment because you don't know what our application process is, but just in general, it's similar to the Community Foundation.
Yeah, I have never applied for your so I don't really have knowledge about your application processes. I'd be happy, to look at it after this and give you some feedback. I hate sort of speculating about processes, but I am trained in looking at processes and procedures and to see where there could be disparate impact in terms of how accessible it is for people of color. So if that's what you're looking for, I'd be happy to engage in that conversation with you.
Great. Okay, thank you. We've gone over, but thank you so much, Reverend Myra. It was just very powerful, and you've generated a lot of thought and questions, and we'll be following up. And I appreciate your offer to look at our processes also, because we're looking at that now.
No, you're very welcome. I did see that Jane Bleeg asked about how can you plug into the reparations group and overall effort.
Yes.
We will be going public with some listening sessions, so I would just be on the lookout for. We'll be making some posts on Facebook, and I know that we're going to be scheduling some radio talks to kind of let the community know what we're working on, where we're headed, and how you can support that effort and how you can engage in the conversations with us around the reparations program that we're looking at right now.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Take care.